You have entered Roguelike Radio.
Hello and welcome to Roguelike Radio, the procedurally generated show where all the participants eventually die. This is episode 84, where we talk about Nethack. Talking this episode we have
John Harris, I wrote AppPlay for a while.
David Ploog, I'm a crawl developer.
And Jeff Lait, I wanted to have Nethack on a Game Boy Advance, so I wrote a game that became Powder.
Pasi Kallinen, I'm the admin of nethack.org.
Patric Mueller, I translated Nethack into German and started a fork of Nethack.
Darren Grey, I created the SporkHack variant.
And I'm Darren Grey, and I've got nothing to do with Nethack. So, this is obviously one of the giants of the genre, possibly the most influential of all the roguelikes, apart from Rogue. Maybe even more influential than Rogue in terms of modern-day roguelikes and modern-day roguelike communities. It's a biggie, this topic. I think it's probably well overdue for the show. But it's an important date now. This the 7th of December is when the last Nethack release was 10 years ago. Now, John, can you perhaps give us a bit of history behind Nethack, where it came from, and why we've not had any updates to it in 10 years?
Well, as for the latter, really, you'd have to ask the dev team, and they are notoriously silent about Nethack, its release schedule, how far they are developing it, and things like that. Which is something that probably dates from the early history of the game, when most of the people who worked on it communicated over Usenet, and I guess they just got sick of answering people's questions. I don't know. But as for the history of the game itself, 1981 was when the computer game Rogue was created, and it immediately became a big hit in college computer labs, which were at the time one of the big places people used, ordinary people or students at least used computers. If you had something at home at that time, but probably a microcomputer like an Apple II. Rogue was written. It was immediately very popular. It was closed source. People immediately started making their own sort of versions of Rogue. A number of variants of Rogue you can find out about on the Roguelike Restoration project back then that are almost forgotten now. Things like Advanced Rogue and Super Rogue. But there are a few other games that sort of took Rogue's concept and kind of mutated it. One of these was Moria, which would eventually develop into the game Angband, which is still. Then there was Larn, which hasn't seen a lot of development recently. And then there's Hack. Jay Finlayson wrote the original Hack. Then it got ported to various different things. Then Mike Stevenson came along, who took the various versions of Hack, sort of folded them into one. Mike Stevenson, you don't really hear the name come up very much, but technically I think he is what you would call the maintainer of Nethack. So he merged all these versions together. Got some other people he met on Usenet together, including Eric S. Raymond, who is a big name in open source circles. People together, and they produced what would become Nethack version 3, which was the first version that's really sort of resembles the game as we know it today. And after a while longer, they released Nethack 3.1, which is essentially modern Nethack, minus a few important features. There might be a new feature here or there, but the game, I usually say that the game as it stands pretty much came about Nethack 3.1. There were definitely major features and changes since then, but it's not really anything comparing, I think, to the difference between Nethack 3 and Nethack 3.1.
One of the funny things is that people started to... Mike Stevenson did Nethack, the first version, because Hack wasn't getting any updates for 2 years. And people were getting fed up with this, and then he gathered around some people and did Nethack. And here we are 10 years, and we have done several forks of Nethack, but I find it rather funny that there are lots of people who are waiting still for the dev team to do a new release when there are when other people are doing the same that the original dev team has done 30 years ago.
Yeah. And of course now the wait has been much longer since stuff after the original Hack. Yeah, that's probably worth saying at this point the sort of history of Nethack with variants. Because there have been a lot of variants of the game. The early days, there was, I say early days, I mean around Nethack 3, Nethack 2.1, there was the version called Nethack The Next Generation that had a lot of really random additions and was loaded with like geek reference to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. If you think NetHack is bad in that regard, NetHack TNG just went overboard with them and was kind of looked down on. It was NetHack -- which eventually evolved into Slash and then Slash'em, which is, I think, for a long time was the most well-known variant. NetHack Plus was a kind of tightened version of NetHack, much more difficult. Then we get to the modern ones, which a couple of people in this very chat have worked on, so.
You talked about the history there, John. Thank you very much for your history lesson. When was it that NetHack really started gaining a big community, a big fan base, a big player base? Because you talked about all these different variants like Hack, and some of them were more or less successful than others, I'm guessing. But when did NetHack manage to get its status as kind of the roguelike?
Well, I think that sort of happened at the time. It was sort of like NetHack versus Moria or the Moria likes. I think it just sort of naturally. I mean, for a while, besides the Moria branch, I don't think there were a good number of roguelikes. And the big proliferation of the genre is a relatively recent thing. I think it just sort of got that by default. It's a big game, and it looks like it contains almost everything in the kitchen sink. And there's a kind of popular perception that games advance. The graphics get better, the sounds get better, so games are obviously getting better. I dispute that, and I think that sort of helped NetHack a reputation a bit. People were saying, "Well, NetHack's now up to version 3, and it's got these things. Now it's 3.1, and now it's got these things." As it kept accreting features like a big snowball. So I think that contributed a lot, and it didn't have a lot of competition besides Moria, which is a very different take on roguelike. NetHack is sort of about weird things and tactics and randomization, and Moria, I think, more of a tactical simulation of combat. More of an emphasis on that. I think that's how NetHack got its reputation, really, sort of by default.
So it's by this whole aggregation of features and the snowball effect you're saying, and then it drew more people on board. And I presume because of that, it got more people making suggestions, more people contributing to the source, and thus grew at a sort of exponential rate.
Well, I don't know about exponential, since it's still always been the dev team that sort of controlled it and acted as the editors, deciding what makes it and what doesn't. Sort of like the place of Linus Torvalds with the Linux operating system. You have to, you can't just add anything. You have to get some editorial vision behind it.
Really?
Well, yeah, NetHack still probably rejected more things than it's included. But, they rejected most of the stuff in NetHack TNG, for example.
I think also one of the prime reasons behind NetHack's sudden surge in popularity is that 3.0 and 3.1 happened to coincide with the Eternal September. An unprecedented amount of people were gaining internet access for the very first time, and for the first time being exposed to all the content that was out there. And at that time, one of the active games with constantly getting new features was NetHack. And in fact, they added so many features that they eventually did put the kitchen sink in it.
Yes, I was just thinking about the Eternal September and how, I got into NetHack and a lot of people did. I think I got it through the shareware type CD type things you could get, and stuff was distributed that way. But one of the big things that attracted people to it was the name. NetHack, of course, was a name for a game where you hacked networks. And so you're like, oh, we got the internet, I want to hack networks and be one of these hacker cracker people. And so you get this game and what's this about fighting monsters? But then you get sucked into it, and here you are many years later still playing the genre.
You really think that's why people got into it?
I know, I thought that when I first saw the name of the game. I know a lot of people that thought the same thing, so.
Okay. The game NetHack, is that, the name itself, is that because it was like a network of hack games, or was it in any way related to the internet that was called NetHack?
I understand it. Oh, sorry. But John will probably say the truth, so I won't say anything.
Oh, yeah. The name comes from just basically it's a version of Hack that was developed over Usenet, thus NetHack.
Yeah. Okay. So essentially, internet combined NetHack. The role of Usenet is probably a big thing, and along with Eternal September was a big expansion in the use of Usenet as a communication channel. And in fact, we've seen a big correlation between the strength of the roguelike genre and the strength of Usenet. About 10 years ago, Usenet started declining, and roguelike use also started declining. Now, we've broken away from that recently, perhaps, but it shouldn't be understated the role of alt. games.roguelike.nethack in bringing people to the genre and keeping them playing, keeping them gelled together, keeping them able to make suggestions and different things like that. It's interesting, actually, early in the internet age, roguelikes were one of the few types of games that you could quite easily download when you're on a 28 kilobyte per second download speed, or whatever other restrictions people had at the time. And they were also, one of the few sort of free games that you could get that had any sort of depth to them. I think that was probably one of the big reasons why Nethack in particular was very popular. And if you look back at early charts from the 90s of the popularity of games in general, there used to be online polls people would have, and I know Adom, for instance, at one point won the most popular game in the world award in terms of, or most popular free game or most downloaded free game or something like that. And Nethack was always very high on kind of charts like that, because it was one of very few games that you can actually get for free and easily download and play on any computer.
Plus it fit on a single floppy disk, and I think that probably had a bigger impact than any of us really realized, because you could drop it onto a single floppy and hand it to somebody and say, "Here, try this."
Especially in a day where games are trying to be 10 floppies to install, so you'd spend there for 10 minutes to find out the game's horrible.
But yes, Nethack has always been a game that you can easily spread online. And also in terms of CDs attached to computer magazines, it could easily be slipped on to these packs of shareware games that you get. I know back in the 90s I used to get hundreds of free shareware games from CDs that were attached to magazines and things like that, and repositories that you download. A lot of people would have been subjected to Nethack through that. It's important to remember Nethack's role in the roguelike community is possibly the most played roguelike of all time. As popular as things like Tome and Dungeons of Dreadmore are these days, they still never achieved this ubiquitousness that Nethack had.
Diablo?
Apart from Diablo.
Well,
the black sheep of the family. But when you speak to people about roguelikes, Nethack is the one that everyone has played. Even people that have never played any other roguelike. A lot of them have played Nethack, especially anyone involved in computer science or with a software background or anything like that. They've all at some point played Nethack.
I'm not sure. Well, first, one thing I understand is Diablo is probably at least 10 times as popular in terms of raw user base than Nethack ever was. I mean, Diablo became a pop cultural phenomenon for a while, whereas Nethack has always been sort of tied up with academia, mostly college students. There's a reason why the game is sometimes referred to derisively as grade wrecker. We say Nethack is being a big thing, but it's really sort of like being the tallest dwarf in the room.
I also don't think that Nethack is the most played roguelike game, but probably the most widespread. It had releases in the 80s, it had releases in the 90s, and it had releases in the last 10 years ago. This is a really long time, and people get exposed to it sometime. And you probably also have that if you try to explain what you are doing with your roguelikes, some people will go, "Oh, like Nethack." They have never seen anything else. They don't know what a roguelike is, but they know what Nethack is. Quite a bit frustrating for the genre, but Nethack had a really lasting impression on people. And I also guess there were generations of computer science students that got initiated by this game and felt that they belonged to a special crowd because they have played the game. And I guess that's one of the reasons why it is so widespread. And the internet is full of computer science people.
I think that's all entirely accurate. Good job.
Derek?
Just an incidental anecdote is actually even my boss had heard of Nethack. So at one point in 2008, I happened to explain to him while I was talking that I was actually writing a variant of it, and he was rather surprised by that. Just like, wait, what? The other thing I would think it was the comparison to Diablo. I think the primary reason people don't recognize Diablo as a roguelike is that it lacks the turn-based. It's actually real-time. But other than that, I think if they could see that, then I think if it was turn-based or if somebody prods them, then I think you'd see a lot of people acknowledge that, yeah, basically Diablo is a roguelike.
I don't know if I would have, though, because I always thought a roguelike was a Nethack. I had to do some relearning when I re-entered the roguelike scene, Craven Powder, and I actually wrote my definition for a roguelike to justify why something with only graphics in it could possibly be a roguelike. Because at the time, people thought roguelikes had to be ASCII. But when I thought of roguelike, I'd think of Nethack, just as Darren was saying earlier. That was my image of a roguelike. But then things like Diablo don't seem like a roguelike. Where's the kitchen sink? Where's the interesting interaction of items? Where's the clever ways to solve problems? Instead you have this grinding, this level gaining, this obvious, sequence of items that I upgrade through. And it was only until I really looked into the Band series and realized actually that whole branch of the roguelike community is very much about that, and is very much like Diablo. So Diablo is very much a band.
Shall we not get too much into this?
Okay.
There's one...
It's just we're talking about because the NetHack really inspired all the hack-like roguelikes, which are a lot of these development-based roguelikes. But there is a vast number of roguelikes which were not particularly inspired by NetHack, but were inspired by the Moria and the Yang Band, which have this very different gameplay. And I think that's why I think Diablo is sitting outside of the NetHack influence.
NetHack is the trope namer.
Talked there about the hack band split, and that used to be a huge thing in the genre. I think it doesn't exist anymore. This categorization of all roguelikes into a hack-like or a band-like. But it used to be that 90% of roguelikes were either a hack-like or a band of some sort, which shows the influence of NetHack on the whole genre. Because there weren't that many hack-likes, I don't think, but NetHack itself represented that entire half of all roguelikes.
First, minor thing about Diablo there. The original version of Diablo, if I remember correctly, there was a development version that was completely turn-based.
Yeah, that was early development.
Yes. But as for the hack versus band thing, although it's not really used the classification too much anymore, I think the idea is still sort of there. And in fact, I've noticed that most of the things that I personally appreciate about roguelikes almost exclusively comes from the hack branch of things, which is probably why I never really got around to covering very many band-type games on AppPlay, because that just seems kind of tedious to me, that sort of grinding. I don't know, it just doesn't appeal to me very much.
Well, if you look at the likes of Syl or Tome, which have a band history, they absolutely don't feel like bands, but they really don't feel like hack-likes either. Rogue has got a hack history, but it doesn't feel quite as hacky as a lot of other hack-likes.
I don't know. I think Rogue is sort of like the foremost development of the hack. I think sort of idea, but that's just me.
Well, it certainly fits in with that area, I think, but it's not as clear-cut as things used to be. It's not as copying NetHack as games used to be.
Yeah,
and there's lots of other games like Infra Arcana, which they're neither. They're roguelikes, but they could have easily just been inspired by Rogue rather than these other things that developed since. I think we've seen a lot more independent things that are following neither hack nor band traditions and just trying to be their own thing. Which is a very positive thing, I think.
Yeah. Well, I'm just saying it in that these are things that have sort of taken what NetHack's gone beyond it, and sort of, I think, left NetHack somewhat in the dust in that regard. I mean, I call them hack-likes, but that's just as a term for this sort of direction of roguelike development. It's just a name, I don't think that they particularly like NetHack. I think that's just where that branch of the tree is led.
I do agree with Darren, though, that, genealogy here doesn't work because they're like bacteria that, shuffle DNA between any particular ancestor they feel like, and even, the sibling games. And so it's nice to see that we're losing that sharp, clean delineation. But when we talk about the influence of NetHack, I think one of its influences, you said, is that it did create a subgenre itself.
Yeah, so while we are talking about the influence of NetHack on various games, so Dungeon Crawl, which is where I come from, obviously owes a huge amount of everything to NetHack. So this starts with the very first developer, Linley Hansel, who was a NetHack and an Angband player and always said so, and then tried to find a combination. But I think that Dungeon Crawl always was more hacky than Angbandy. But my main point is, and perhaps we can talk about this later, is that what we have learned in Dungeon Crawl Stone Soup from NetHack is mostly how not to do things. So the effect of NetHack is still huge, but somehow we have learned how to avoid its development model, and we have also learned how to avoid the design pitfalls. So NetHack is still important, but it's a different role than it had maybe 10 years ago.
I think it's been a bit the same in ADOM too, which very, very clearly modelled on NetHack, but also trying to do certain specific things differently. like trying to have a bit more theme and story to it, going in a different direction from Crawl, but defining itself as like Thomas Biscuits himself has said, he played NetHack. There's bits of it he didn't like. He wanted to make a game that he liked that was different.
Just a quick thought out there for the group of this is if you were to identify a signature feature of NetHack, I would think that the thing that made it NetHack-like instead of ADOM-like or Crawl-like or Angband-like or anything would be that in a NetHack-like, you can typically do everything to almost everything, whereas in many other roguelikes, the interactions with items are far more limited or are very specified out by the teams.
Yeah, I agree with that summary that it's the interaction of items that really makes me feel like this is an NetHack type thing. And when I went and developed Powder, it was kind of different than a lot of people like developing Crawl, where they wanted to avoid the mistakes they saw in NetHack. I didn't see any mistakes in NetHack at the time. It wouldn't fit on a Game Boy Advance. Not just in terms of memory or processing, but in terms of just the view screen is suddenly very different. So you can't put on your blindfold and see the whole world all at once, and then your play is going to change completely. And so I thought I just need to start over again from scratch, but I started very wholesale copying everything from NetHack over until I realized that I should actually, pick my own direction.
David?
Yeah, so I kind of agree with what Derek says about what makes a roguelike very NetHacky, or what singles out NetHack, but I would phrase it a bit differently. To me, NetHack is the game about special cases, and this is basically what Derek says, but it's a slightly more negative drift on it. So for everything, we have another special case, and then there's probably still a third special case if you're also stunned or something, and this is what makes NetHack the game it is, but also what it makes not so good for me.
Derek's question is exactly what makes NetHack NetHack, and I guess we have different answers to that question. And for me, it is also those interaction with the items and interaction with everything. Actually, you have a few megabytes of code that are, as David also said, almost always special cases. This makes NetHack very difficult to experience without spoilers. You have to look up many things. You go on the net nowadays, but in the early days you had to go source diving, look up the code, get confused, start to understand C and program. Probably NetHack created more C programmer than any other program or people who are out there, because people wanted to know how this strange spaghetti code works, and afterwards they were doing it themselves, and probably lots of shitty code there is out there is because of that.
That's an interesting influence idea. Pasi?
I do have to agree that it's all the puzzle-like elements, all the interactions that really make NetHack what it is. But if I may be a bit controversial, one of the things that makes NetHack very different from the banned variants is that NetHack doesn't show solid walls. So when you walk in a corridor, you don't see the walls of the corridor.
Rogue had that, though.
Yes.
So
There's
I would just see that as
for that. You can patch that in if you like, but I think almost no variant of NetHack does it.
Interesting. John?
NetHack as the game with special cases. There is definitely this element of the game as well, but as one thing about the game I've noticed as playing it is that there are definitely those types of things. And if you encounter a Master Lich in the dungeon, for example, if you don't know how to handle it, you're probably going to die very quickly. And there are the class of NetHack monsters that are like that, like cockatrices and medusas and black dragons, where there's specific counters to them. And if you don't yet have that, then that's where your game ends. And a lot of NetHack is the process of collecting those counters. You're building what they refer to as the Ascension Kit, which I think is a term that's sort of gone on to gain currency outside of NetHack, actually. But as far as the special cases, it should be mentioned that the game does have a couple of mechanisms in the game that teach players about these things. Those would be fortune cookies, and especially the Oracle, which is relatively early in the game, who, if you pay her enough money, will reveal you some significant fact about NetHack. And if you were to read all of the Oracle texts, at once, then it would give you, I think, a pretty good idea of what you need to do to win NetHack. The problem is you're not going to have enough money to do that in a single game or even mini games because the oracles are distributed randomly and you'll probably only get 1 or 2 a game at that point. As a result is the information you need to win NetHack is provided by the game, but it's going to take you months to find it all. And I think that's really sort of what's driven many people to spoilers. And yeah, I don't think I'm fond of that aspect of the game. But to be fair to it, it is in the game. It's just, up to that point, I think players aren't really intended to play to win, but to play for score. Anyway.
Yeah, I would say that the average time it takes to beat NetHack is probably longer than a bachelor's course. It's seen as a very significant thing, and it's the same with a few of the very major roguelikes. It takes its time, but NetHack, especially if you don't use spoilers, that is a gigantic challenge. One of the biggest challenges in all of gaming, perhaps. Mm-hmm. Just on the thing of interaction with everything that NetHack has, and it's definitely a very core part of NetHack. But it's also, concerning what we were saying earlier about roguelikes being influenced by NetHack, it's also one of those things that I see many people list as what they require from a roguelike. And lots of roguelikes do to a lesser degree than NetHack. But from both inside and outside the community, I've seen that as being a central definition of roguelikes, and I think that's primarily the NetHack influence again. A lot of people I've seen that are put off roguelikes are because they associate it entirely with many of these obscure things that NetHack has. That's what they see as defining part of the genre, even though there are many roguelikes that aren't like that. Well,
and especially the penalty for not knowing the particular solution for a monster or a situation in NetHack is there are an awful lot of those secrets that you have to learn, that you could learn from the Oracle or you could learn from a fortune cookie. And a great deal of those secrets are ones that protect you from what would otherwise be the ha-ha you die monsters or the ha-ha you die situations, the castle drawbridge being the most obvious one, but there are some others.
That castle drawbridge, yeah. I don't think I've ever died at the castle drawbridge because I was pretty thoroughly spoiled early in my NetHack history. But yeah, I think there are a lot of insta-deaths in the big list of ways to die in NetHack that are attributable to that one damn drawbridge. As for why NetHack is kind of like that, I think it goes back to sort of like the early history of roguelike, back when Rogue was new. It was still familiar in everyone's memory. And that was sort of the direction it went for a while. I mean, like Medusa. In modern NetHack, Medusa is in a special level. And at that point, you probably have some sort of version of ESP anyway, so you can see her from a distance. And once you see the monster over there, a green @ sign that identifies as Medusa, then there's a good chance when you see that you'll think, maybe I should have a blindfold on. But before that, Medusa was a monster who appeared in an ordinary dungeon level. And can you imagine what that would have been like? Oh, I died. You just walk into a room. Oh, Medusa's in this one. Oh, that ends that game. It's not a specific level, but sort of like a random, I think, level in a range that she showed up. I mean, I think NetHack has actually kind of gone back a bit from just trying to kill people out of the blue. There's still a lot of it in there, definitely. But at least Medusa doesn't show up just on a random dungeon level anymore. But I think that comes from the back with the Roguelike Restoration Project games, games like Super Rogue, I think we're less shy about killing the player. Anyway, I'm done.
Potion of Death comes to mind from the Eggman series there.
Yeah, when you don't have all your potions identified, you decide to try and drink identify things, and Ploog, dead. There's a few games with things similar to that.
Few games other than NetHack are quite so enthusiastic about killing off the player, though.
True. But there is a certain thing of players liking that, I think. For a moment, the dev team got mentioned a few times earlier with the history, and there's not been a new version in 10 years. Who are the dev team?
Right now it's Pat Rankin, Michael C. His last name starts with C. I think the active dev team who probably even really exist or even pretend to have a hand in it anymore. I think it's really 3 people. I know that if I ever wanted, even back when I was still actively developing, if I ever actually wanted to talk to the dev team, I just went straight to Pat Rankin because he was the only one that would even remotely respond.
And why is there this pretense that they're still active? Why is there this pretense that they're a dev team when they're not developing?
Version veneration, variant veneration, whatever. I think we called it at one point talking in IRC. There are some people, or I shouldn't say some, there's an entire group of people who simply will not accept anything other than NetHack proper as being NetHack. And I can't answer that question because probably about 5 or 6 years ago, I mean, I obviously decided that the dev team was never actually going to ship anything ever again, and I went my own way. But like you said, there are still people out there waiting to this day, 10 years after the last release, and it's patently obvious that it's done. And there are still people out there waiting, like, well, maybe they'll release soon. What about the next version? Like, yeah, not so much.
And interestingly enough, I mean, Crawl had the same issue, and Crawl Stone Soup actually managed to restart and move everyone over to the point now people think Crawl, they just think Stone Soup. They forget there was ever that big bifurcation and all those wars and flame wars about whether or not they were allowed to do this or not.
But it took basically a hostile takeover to do it, too. You had basically a fresh dev team from DPEG and JPEG coming in from the outside and saying, and now we shall remake Crawl. David says no. David?
David, please do correct the history there.
Yeah, I think one of the really good things that happened with Crawl is that Linley Hansel, the sole founder and first developer of Dungeon Crawl, when he left because he had no time anymore, he handed over the whole project. This is something that I would have recommended to the NetHack dev team, but the point is the time has passed. And he handed it over to a dev team, and of this dev team only one developer, Brent Ross, emerged. And it is true that he somehow faded away into obscurity and he cannot be reached anymore. But when then Eric and Darshan founded Dungeon Crawl Stone Soup, it wasn't really hostile. It was just that the project was obviously dormant and they picked it up. There was, I think the NetHack crowd is much more conservative than what you have in other games. So I don't think it was really hostile, and it was definitely not hostile from the original founder to the next generation. That was a very friendly turnover.
And the original developer of Crawl even acknowledged the Stone Soup fork as a good one. So they even have the blessing of the original developer.
We've seen similar things with Cataclysm lately. It was peacefully handed over to another team. There's a couple of different variants of it now, but the Cataclysm Dark Days Ahead expansion seems to be the dominant one that people are now associating with Cataclysm. Does anyone know the Angband history? Has it just stayed with the same developer team, or sort of shifting between developer teams? Because it's actually still releasing. It's probably the longest, one of the longest sequences of sort of multiple releases like that.
I can think of two big transitions just when I was reading the Angband groups. I mean, there was, unfortunately I don't remember the name, someone else hopefully knows more details. There was a person that cleaned up the whole code and created this sort of variant, Bonzenza, but then that fork got very staid and solid, and people weren't even putting squelch in, and vanilla was really stuck. And then there was again one of these sort of, we need to restart it, and somehow it actually did seem to restart, and all of a sudden we were getting new Angband versions again. Because for a while Angband was longer than NetHack without a release, and then all of a sudden it started releasing.
Okay, so something similar could happen with NetHack. Maybe.
The problem with NetHack's dev team is that it is still showing some signs of life. So they do update their bug list, and they claim they've got a version under development that has these and these fixes. So it is really hard to wrest control from them.
Well, I do remember when the Stone Soup moved in, Brent Ross did have active development and did have a new combat model that was under development. And I think as David Ploog said, that in the end it became a peaceful takeover. But to begin with, there was a lot of like, I have all this stuff that's coming up soon now. Just wait, and then people realize, okay, we'll go with this.
So with NetHack, there has been a wide number of variants so far, and we've got a few people responsible for that here. Have any of them had similar levels of success in NetHack, or taken the kind of main crown as NetHack's successor?
No, but for a long time you had Slashem, let's call it the ugly cousin of NetHack. It's everything that didn't went into NetHack went into Slashem.
Wow. Okay. So it had a lot of extra junk.
Yes. And I guess this is also one of the issues we had a long time, because around 2000, at the time when I started to get back into NetHack, I felt it was, if you had to criticize something about NetHack, you got the response, if you don't like NetHack, then go to /m. But this is obviously not a real solution. If you think a little thing is wrong with NetHack, you don't want to get the kitchen sink and the toilet and the kitchen and the cook with it.
But if you do want all that, that's really cool for you, I suppose. John?
He's not kidding about the toilet. If you think NetHack's bad, /m has probably at least twice as much stuff on it. Everything from Great Cthulhu to assault weapons to gypsies. I say assault weapons, I mean like guns with ammunition you have to find. It's really kind of ludicrous, but it's kind of entertaining for what it is. But I think it's more of like something to gawk at than a real game. Anyway.
But people play it. People have fun with it.
Yeah, it's basically /m really makes no pretenses about what it is. It's literally the dumping ground for everything. But what that did mean is, I know that in my case, I used to respond to feature requests with, if this feature came from /m, it already has 2 strikes against it. And also as far as any of the variants trying to become Nethack, I know I used to respond to that quite a bit and say I'm not trying to be NetHack 4. One of my original goals with releasing the variant was, in fact, when I originally started on it, one of my goals was really to try to push the dev team into doing something, and it did not work. And then the variant really took on a life of its own, and I was like, well, I'm still not going to try to be NetHack 4. Instead, I'm going to be this. We'll let somebody come along and be NetHack 4. And I'll let Patric correct me if I'm wrong, but I think UnNethack has certainly gone the same way, in that he's not really trying to be NetHack 4 with UnNethack. And I think that it's possible that all that's really, well, I've certainly said this before, that I think that it's possible that all it takes for someone to be NetHack 4 is to decide that they're going to be NetHack 4, call themselves NetHack 4, and then actually start shipping a code base of a playable NetHack 4.
Someone's already, I think, done that. I think there is someone out there who's making something called NetHack 4. I don't know.
I have seen that, but it's kind of stalled on development. But if it did take off properly, it probably would be. There was a lot of positive sort of voices around it, because it was kind of trying to rewrite a lot of the code base to be more modern and to work better and to be more expandable. But it never really took off properly. The developer disappeared, I believe. Patric?
Well, the history of NetHack 4 is, of the variant NetHack 4 is a bit complicated. There was the NitroHack variant that did more or less a engine rewrite of NetHack, made a new curses UI, and separated the game code into a server and client part, and tried to modernize it a bit in that regard. This one had quite a good response from the community, although I think for the wrong reasons, because it was more or less just a UI refurbishment. You had a modern curses UI, but the game itself and the design flaws in the game strike that. It was more or less just a UI refurbishment. It didn't change anything about the design issues that NetHack has, and it even didn't change anything about the core engine code. So you still had all those special cases. You had all the code that was really spaghetti, and if you didn't understand the original NetHack code, it wouldn't have helped you if you looked at NitroHack. And the developer that did NetHack 4, or is doing actually, there are still commits, more or less did just that, what Derek said. He took NitroHack and called it NetHack 4, and took part of his previous fork, AceHack, which was also a UI refurbishment. You see that they have, in my opinion, all the same issue, and he's now doing some bug fixes, and is actually trying to release something. But we don't know when this will happen, and when that release will have appeared, we don't actually know where he's going to go with the game issues. but time will tell.
So Patric, when it came to making UnNethack yourself, what was the motivation for you?
Actually, I just wanted to do a fork that was not as inclusive as /m, and not as hard, or let's say not as controversial in the community as SporkHack. SporkHack has lots of great ideas. Problem is, Derek is not always nice to those that criticize it, even when the criticism is not. When the criticism is without any reason. So SporkHack was rather controversial, although the good NetHack players liked it really a lot. They always say that SporkHack is a challenge if you can ascend NetHack with any conduct you want. So I tried to find a middle ground between /m, SporkHack, and NetHack with UnNethack, and I still hope we are somehow hitting that point.
And what are the primary differences between it and NetHack?
Actually, in the beginning, I didn't do lots of design decisions. I just took the good parts from other forks. So lots of SporkHack went into UnNethack, very little of /m went into UnNethack, and then I started to think. I had to start to think because the low-hanging fruits was all taken. I don't try to make. As I said, I tried to make UnNethack like NetHack would have been, because I don't want to do a crawl, I don't want to do a Angband or a tome. I just want to have a modernized NetHack variant, without the bugs, without the obvious design issues. And obviously I have to do that myself because nobody else does it.
So what are some of the modernizations? What are some of the design issues that you fixed?
For example, the poison insta-deaths are, as you may know, legion in NetHack. You can die to poison at any part of the game if you are not poison resistant. It doesn't matter if you have a HP of 100. You are just dead if there's a 20 die rolled, if you fall into spiked pit. Something like that. I don't think the spoiler issue is that big a problem, because spoilers are so in this game, you have a really hard time to get them out of the game. If I would like to get the need for spoilers out of UnNethack, I would actually have to write a different game. This is almost not possible at this time of the development. Then, of course, the UI is bad, and you have to improve it. If you look at the public server nethack.alt.org, this one is already an improved version of the original NetHack. You don't have colors in your inventory. You can see at a glance if your items are cursed or blessed or uncursed. Just by the color, you have to read it. Or another one is that the HP monitor is not in the original NetHack code. So if you are low on HP in the vanilla code, you don't get a hint. The UI doesn't warn you. At least in the newer versions in the newer forks, you get visual input that you are low on HP. It's over 4 years, it's been lots of small and bigger things, like more dungeon levels, more variants. Fixing Sokoban. I heard on the show that you are that you were shocked that you heard that Sokoban had fixed layouts and fixed prices.
I'm still shocked that it's still in the game. But go on, what have you changed about Sokoban?
Sokoban is actually not one of the pieces that it has been long in the game. It's entered NetHack with 3.3, which is 1996 released, if I'm not mistaken. Or
only been there 17 years then.
Or maybe 1999. And yes, you have a fixed layout in a game of randomness. You have fixed prices. That means you don't even have to do the last level to see what the price is that you get, because you can look up in the spoiler, do I get a bag of holding or an amulet of reflection? And many players do this and see, and most of those players don't even do the last level because if they don't get what they want, they don't have to do it. It's clear.
And probably worse on top of it, not only is Sokoban completely unrandomized, and it really is just kind of a slog until you see whether you get the prize you were looking for. The worst part of it is that there's so much useful stuff inside Sokoban. It's loaded down with food. It's got guaranteed wands and rings in it. It's for a player, it's one of the least Nethacky portions of Nethack. And yet, if you're going to actually try to win, you have to go through Sokoban. You can't pass it up because there's too much free stuff there.
So, Patrick, do you still have Sokoban on Nethack?
Yes. Just to say what you get, what is it? 4 rings, 4 wands, and 8 food items, stacks of food. So it's in the early game. This is really important to get food. So and then you get it for free in Sokoban, more or less for free. There's little danger in Sokoban to die. And yes, I still have it. And maybe because I am one of the few people who actually like Sokoban. But this is also a developer tip. Do also play your own game, because I didn't always do it, and because coding is more fun. And Sokoban is actually not that bad to me. But every time I played it, I noticed, I have played several Sokoban levels, fine. There's another one coming up. Oh no. I noticed playing 4 of those is just boring. And 3 is better. So now there are only 3 in my game. And the prizes are randomized in the sense that there are now 3 different items, a bag, a amulet, and a bag of holding. And you can choose, and the amulet and it's a cloak, it's a amulet, and it's a bag of holding. So, and the amulet and cloak are randomized, and you only see it when you are near the items what it is. And if you take one of those, the other 2 disappear. So it's now slightly more random, and it's still the issue that it's a little bit too much items generated, but as I said, it's still Nethack, and taking Sokoban out of Nethack would make it less Nethack, and that's why it's still in there, and I like it.
Okay, the only person, but okay. Jeff?
You didn't mention something which I think you did do, which is remove the luck penalty from UnNethack.
Oh yes, of course. This is also one of the things that make Sokoban extremely un-Nethacky, because in every other part of the game, you are encouraged to do things, to explore, to do strange things, try to get not cheat the game, but to exploit the game and do strange stuff that maybe the dev team didn't think about. And so do you get an advantage in the game. For example, in shops, Nethack shops are not like crawl shops. You have a room full of items and a shopkeeper. And you can go into the room and pick up items and buy it from those shopkeepers. But you can also steal them. And in early version, it was rather easy to steal items. You just had to, just a wand of digging and digging down, and everything you picked up, you had now. And what did the dev team do? They didn't disallow using a wand of digging in the shop, but they made it so that the shopkeeper, if it was near enough, he would jump to you, get your backpack, and then you would fall down the hole without any inventory. So you tried to cheat the game, but the game cheated you. And in Sokoban, it is the other way around. If you use any of the items in the game, like a wand of striking to destroy a boulder, and then read a scroll of earth to generate new boulders in another place, so it was easier to solve the Sokoban puzzle, the game would punish you with a luck penalty, which is this early in the game really deadly. And most players, even if they screw up Sokoban, they quit the game or leave Sokoban alone because they fear the luck penalty. And this is completely unnethacky actually, and I just removed that because it doesn't make any sense actually. It's not how NetHack should be played. The only thing now the game says is, did you do Sokoban the official way, or did you trick your way to the prize? This is just a line in the dump log when your game finishes.
Yeah, so just to clarify the luck penalty, if I remember properly, that's like a hidden stat, so I don't know that I lost a luck penalty. I'll just start dying later on in the game.
Well, the effect of luck on the game, a +1 or -1 to luck isn't that big a deal generally. The main problem is, if your luck is below 0, then prayer doesn't work. And you'll get a bad effect always from prayer. And if you're relying on your god to get you out of trouble, then if you've done something that dings you a point of luck earlier, then what ordinarily a situation you could survive becomes a death.
Yeah, that's what sort of got me about Sokoban, is they used to give, Scroll of Earth right there to tell you, hey, I can solve this puzzle cleverly with the Scroll of Earth, but then secretly remove your luck, so then you die later mysteriously because your prayer didn't work, and you have to figure out that was because you cheated in Sokoban earlier, as opposed to the other sort of, haha, you're dead, like with the cockatrice, you know sort of what killed you. Here it's pretty much by spoiling, I think.
Yeah. I don't think the Oracle tells you about that either. That's a relatively new addition to the game. I mean,
Yeah, it's quite evil. That's really that's one of the worst things you can do in a game. Punish someone for being clever in your game, but do it invisibly so they die. That's
And do it in a game which is all about trying to be clever. Because I know when, for example, I was fighting a leprechaun and I decided, I'll drop all my gold on the ground so I can't steal it. And then it says the leprechaun grabs the gold under your feet and teleports away. I was trying to be clever, and they had thought of it and prevented me from being clever. But I was like, that's funny, because, they had thought of it, but I knew about it right away. As opposed to this sort of, secret, we knew you were trying to be clever, but we'll just secretly punish you.
Yeah, I think hidden stats are one of those things that are generally bad in games. Hidden stats and no notification of those hidden stats changing, and no clear indication of how those stats are having an impact on the game.
Well, I mean, there's a big argument to be had there, and I know some games that do hidden stats in interesting ways that aren't roguelikes. I don't think hidden stats are a necessarily bad thing, but this thing in NetHack, I think it's more the implication of this hidden stat. If you get that -1 to luck, it takes you below 0, then prayer doesn't work. And that's the thing that a lot of new players rely on. So I think that implication here is bad.
Maybe it's more hidden punishment that is a bad thing. If you're punishing someone for doing something, but you're doing it in a completely secret way, that they can never really find out about.
Yeah, it sort of negates the whole purpose of punishment if you think about it.
Yeah, indeed. Patrick, you mentioned shops there. Actually, it's one of those things that we were talking about what makes NetHack, and shops are one of those things that are quintessentially NetHack, this way of doing shops so that you can actually steal items from them in inventive ways. And other games have done this, ADOM and Dreadmore, for instance, but they've done it specifically because NetHack did it. I think that's one of those things that, when we think about NetHack giving you options, shops is one of the best examples of that, because there are so many ways to do clever little things with shops in the game.
Let's not also forget Spelunky, that also has such shops.
Yeah, and every game that has shop stealing like that, I love, because it's just one of those things that it just fits in so well. And admittedly, there's non-roguelikes that let you steal from shops, but never quite in that same, now the shopkeeper's going to kill me, or whatever else kind of way that makes it really quite fun. That it's a dangerous but rewarding activity.
I tried to talk the Stone Soup developers into changing their shops, but they just don't listen. They don't like NetHack shops. They want their vending machines.
Yeah, vending machines are boring.
There was a very early example of shop stealing, actually, which was Ultima 4, right? Where all objects had their ownership, so you could break into people's houses and steal. And this had the hidden punishment where your, karma for honesty or whatever went down that you wouldn't find out until you went to a shrine. But in that case, the hidden punishment I actually thought was very clever, because it was trying to get these game players to actually think about trying to live the virtues of the avatar. And traditionally in games, you just steal everywhere you want, and there's no punishment. And just sort of like with a real virtue of stealing, it's not just because I steal because I don't get caught, I should just not steal. So even though it looks like I'm not getting caught, doesn't mean that there shouldn't be any hidden consequence. But I think that was inside of a larger framework where I wasn't expected to, be unvirtuous. Whereas in NetHack, I'm expected to steal from shops.
Yeah. One of the Zeldas did it as well. You could steal items in a certain way, but your name would get changed to Thief in capital letters, and you couldn't change it.
Furthermore, if you went back into that room in Zelda Link's Awakening, you'd get instantly killed by the shopkeeper.
Because that's how you deal with thieves.
It's kind of a harsh punishment for a Nintendo game, if you think about it.
But I personally really like this whole idea of the shop isn't just a way of exchanging items, it's a system in the game. Just like, the cockatrice isn't just a monster to be killed, it's a whole system itself that has various interactions around it, and that is very quintessentially NetHack.
It works as part of the game, not as a separate feature within it.
Yeah, it uses all the other game systems, like the Wand of Digging or Invisibility or all these other systems. It integrates them into a kind of simulation system that works with everything else in the game.
Although there are bad design issues about shops as well, the price identification. If you buy or sell an item, you get a price offered by the shopkeeper, and then you can look it up in a table, and then you can try to deduce what item it is. And this is a horrible feature. With this feature, players start to get their whole stash and put it into the shop to identify it. And this is a boring thing, and many people don't even notice that this is boring, and this is even the worst stuff about this.
ADOM does it a bit better in that ADOM has a sort of selling identification system in that you get offered a price by the shopkeeper for what you're trying to sell, but there's so many variables involved that there's no way for you to just look up what an item is, but you can compare items of similar type or something and get an idea of what's good and what's bad. But it's just sort of one little hint of information in a wider puzzle. I actually kind of like that in a way in ADOM, in that it becomes this in-game puzzle. Along with other things you might know about that item based on other things happening. So the whole item identification system has various different little hints rather than a straight, this is definitely this.
Should be mentioned that the dev team to some extent has sort of recognized this, and that the prices of items are grouped into categories. So even if you know that one item is a certain price, there is, it's easy to confuse with other items of the same price. And it's usually set up that there's always one bad item in a price range. So it's not definite, though you can use it to greatly narrow down what an item is. And also, occasionally, randomly, a particular item will be priced to the next price category above, which makes things up a little bit more. I think I do agree that NetHack's price ID is a bit annoying. Sheer and the Wander, a game that people don't seem to be able to shut me up about, does price ID the same way, with there being various items the same price, and it's always at least one bad item in each range. But in that game, you don't generally explore back and forth through the dungeon. You're going on a one-way trip. So it's less likely to create boring behavior because you can't really use stashes. Anyway.
David?
Yeah, so I don't want to sound like this is bad about NetHack and that is bad. NetHack has some pretty cool things, and shops are one of them. Another one is the starting pet. So these are really cool features, and given that these are ASCII games, they are really sexy. What is bad about NetHack shops, and which is why calls shops are not like this, is the selling part rather than the buying. The buying and the stealing is fine, but being able to sell every little thing in the dungeon to a shop is a really, really bad idea, and know what I'm talking about, because I have cleared Fort Ludios, and then I moved all the stuff from all the dead soldiers to some shop, and then I sold it there. And this is not fun. It's not, of course, it's not necessary either, but somehow I have to bring up the mental discipline to not do this, and I was too young to bring up this discipline, and so I did it, and I hated it. And I think selling is a way of grinding that just shouldn't exist, and this is bad about NetHack shops. The stealing is perfectly fine.
Yeah, I can definitely see your point there. I think there's a lot of different grindy things in NetHack and a lot of roguelikes, and you can always say, oh, but you don't have to do that, and oh, it doesn't really help you that much, but a lot of us have this compulsion in us that we feel we have to, and definitely, we've seen this in a lot of games, not just NetHack, but things like Skyrim. People have this compulsion to just pick up everything and sell everything. and it ends up producing some very bad gamer behavior. And it's due to bad game design, not due to the players behaving badly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, if it's not fun, why do it? I mean, there's...
Because you get an advantage, a number goes up.
But
You're taught throughout the game that this number is valuable, and now suddenly there's a way of making this number go up. The game is hardwired into making you do that, and to resist that is to resist the whole system of the game itself. Not that easy.
First, reason selling us Nethack is this is something that hasn't really been mentioned up to this point. I think it's kind of a good way to sort of bring this in as well. Is Nethack, I think, isn't just made to be a roguelike. I think it's also sort of meant to be a kind of callback to classic sort of Dungeons and Dragons play. And that's the kind of thing that players do in classic Dungeons and Dragons do. They'll try to bring every bit of loot they can back to the town to sell it. And that is at least narrowed down a bit by the fact that you can only carry so much. But I think there was probably a contingent in the dev team that really wanted to keep those classic sort of D&D options in there. And that might be why they're sort of selling us like that. I mean, I can agree that bringing every item back is something that players, might feel compelled to do. That it's boring. But I don't think it necessarily means that selling itself is bad. There might be other solutions, like not having a shop say, okay, we already have one of those, no more. We're full stock, or maybe severely underpricing things that you sell them because they might be damaged. But that's just speculation.
Yeah, I think there's definitely things like that. Derek?
Yeah, I have a couple of quick thoughts. One is regarding NetHack's how NetHack drew from D&D. If you ever go back to an old version 2 player's handbook and go down the list of weapons that you can buy, especially the pole arms, you will find every single one of them in
Absolutely.
the D&D player's handbook. That is exactly where they got it from. Because who else puts an Atlas in the game? How many people even knew what an Atlas was other than D&D players before they ran into NetHack?
I'll tell you who knew. Gary Gygax knew, and he wrote a book on polearms.
Yes, exactly. And all 12 polearms are in NetHack.
These are called Dungeons and Polearms.
Yes, oh god. That was one of the earlier things I did, is rip a ton of the polearms out, because I'm like, God, it's a blade on a stick. We don't need 12. As far as you don't have to do that, I very rapidly got tired of responding to that criticism leveled at SporkHack. They're like, well, why'd you remove that? They're like, because it's stupid and because it's unbalancing. They say, well, you don't have to do it. And it's like, you know what? It goes back to the thing about Sokoban is, no, you don't have to do Sokoban. This happens to be a good example. But you pass up such a huge advantage in the game that, especially the type of person that gravitates towards NetHack, tends to be a little bit power gamer on the side, probably a little bit munchkin-y, which isn't bad. You can build a game to cater to that, but at the same time, if you dangle boring stuff in front of them that nevertheless involves a significant advantage in the game, sure enough, you're going to find every one of those people just plowing through, mindlessly pushing the button on Sokoban. Going all the way through Fort Ludios and taking every piece of armor back. You already see that, in fact. People take every piece of armor in Fort Ludios back to an altar and look for the +4, +5, even though most of it is not armor you're going to keep for the rest of the game anyway.
There's so many grindy things going on in the Angband variants, but there are certainly some of those in NetHack too. And when you're dangling something like pudding farming in front of players' noses, they certainly will do that, especially because it gives basically unlimited wishes. That's definitely part of what Derek and Patric have tried to do with their variants, reducing all these grindy elements of the game.
The thing about gold in NetHack, and it's something that players gone their way through the game the first time don't realize, so I am semi-agreeing with them, is that gold is almost useless in NetHack. You can use it in shops, but shops are really only interesting in the early part of the game. You use it to buy protection, which is big, but a limited amount of money. You don't need that much money really to do it, compared to all the money that there is in the game. And use it to bribe the demon lords deep in the game, and you can probably just smack him to death by that point anyway. Yeah, it's this big thing that's in the game, and that in its score, but it's a very small factor in your score, really. So really, gold is very little use for it in NetHack. From my point of view, I obviously say things like, why do it? But that's only because I know that gold is not really good for that much, ultimately. And other players not knowing that, yeah, I can see how you guys would arrive at that conclusion. So good point.
Well, you're saying early in the game it's still got a use. In particular, you find a shop. So your instinct early in the game, the shop has something useful. Let's hoover out all of the levels around it so that I can get this item. And that is, in particular, something for new players coming to the game, finding useful stuff in a shop. They want it. The only way they can see to get it is to hoover around the dungeon, shove all this stuff into it, and get a nice item out.
Right. New players, yeah. Whereas I generally don't do that only because I know most of the stuff in that shop's useless anyway.
Yeah, but it's the new players that you don't want doing these sorts of things. So the whole, you don't have to do that thing, it's very hard to teach that to a new player. So you're better off. If veteran players aren't doing it, and new players are doing it to a bad way that ends up putting them off, then that's a very negative thing in the game.
Well, and also your experienced players are the ones that are going to find out how to break it, because the value of gold, remember, you mentioned buying protection, and that's the primary gold abuse that I see in NetHack. The first 10 points come for free. The next 10 points you can get, you have to throw rather a lot of gold because there's a chance you won't get the protection. So you can always find something to do with gold, and unfortunately that thing is go buy extra points of armor. And, in a game based on D&D's armor class, a full extra 20 points of armor class, which is what you can get with protection, it's another place in the game where you can just put your thumb on the scale and push down firmly.
Armor class in NetHack is even more broken than in D&D. A usual player gets minus 20 without a problem. And this is ascending with this armor class is almost trivial, but most players go down to minus 40, minus 48. And they have to grind if they don't find the right armor because they think they need it, but they actually wouldn't need it.
Yeah, it would have been better if they just capped it like D&D caps it. It brings up one thing, actually, that I think NetHack suffers from, is that it's taken a lot of D&D rules and then tried to extend it to points where it breaks, or just sort of thrown things in without too much thought. There's a lot of D&D stuff that, it's designed for pen and paper role-playing where the dungeon master can just override the dice rolls any point he likes anyway. But in NetHack, it's in a stuck computer system, and it's taken these systems and adapted them quite badly, I think.
Well, I think a lot of what's interesting about NetHack comes from sort of that adherence to classic D&D stuff. But
yeah, but I think some of it is just a bit blind, perhaps.
Maybe.
Jeff?
Well, also, some of it, I think, was blindly copied. That explains the polearms, at least. But the other part of it is that it was extended beyond the level limits of D&D. D&D was designed, up to like level 20 or so, and then really you can't continue playing with those rule sets anymore. Whereas with like NetHack, they go to level 30, I think you end up with by your potions of gain level, and then the armor class goes off to minus 45, which is just crazy zone, and you have to just the whole system breaks down if you have too wide of a gap between your start and your end.
Yeah. Okay, just to move things along a little bit, I quizzed Patrick a bit on UnNethack. Derek, are you prepared for the same quizzing? Can you explain what SporkHack is and what makes it so unique? And why is there such controversy around it?
I can explain many of those things. SporkHack was obviously one of the earlier variants, so I really kind of knew going in that I was going to be swimming against the tide. And I meant to mention that earlier. I want to point out to Patrick that I have been nothing but sweetness and light to all my critics.
I have Usenet postings that
he has evidence.
I don't know who wrote those. It's obviously an imposter. But no, anyway, the biggest gotcha, the biggest thing that came from creating SporkHack is that really I was seeing at the time the top players basically just plow through the game and just beat it like a drum. The vanilla game, and just they knew exactly where every exploit was. They knew exactly where, as I mentioned earlier, they knew exactly where to put their thumb on the scale. And so it really started out to some degree is to say, okay, when in a game as ostensibly hard as NetHack is, and as ostensibly random, the reality of the game doesn't match. The reality of how the game can be beaten and how frequently the game can be beaten doesn't match people's public perception of it. In other words, there's the average player's perception of NetHack was that, oh my gosh, it was very difficult. And in reality, you had guys like Mike at the time, Mike G from the NetHack channel that played on alt.org. I think he ascended 29 in a row. And then two people have come along afterwards, Adion and the gentleman we call Zip Code. I think his handle is N78291. I don't know. We just call him Zip Code. But both of those guys broke that record not long after. And it was like, okay, there is absolutely no way that a game that's supposed to be a challenge should be winnable, 30 times in a row or more. So that was really the first thing. I just wanted to come through and I just really wanted to come through and hammer down the most obvious nails. Easily the most controversial was the decision to break pudding farming irrevocably, and that I still can't understand how people actually considered that to be such a big deal, other than that I was barbecuing a sacred cow, and. And it was it astonished me early on the amount of pushback that I got, and I even went in knowing that it was going to be that way. But after that, it really, again, one of the initial goals was to say, to the dev team, hey, if you're not going to make changes, I will, and I'm going to add features, not just sit and look at the 400 bug fixes that you haven't released and start reproducing those on my side. It's like I'm going to try to take it and see where it goes, and unfortunately, they didn't respond at all. In fact, I really expected it to either spur development or at least spur conversation about development, and I got just a brick wall. And then I was just sitting here looking at a variant, and I'm like, well, I've got a variant now, and it appears that I'm the only person developing NetHack. Off we go, and then it really went on from there.
John, do you want to come in on on Marvin?
Yeah, that's the way the dev team seems to react to most things. I think that one guy is really their public face. They've been silent. I'm not even sure why they maintain their silence now. But on winning 3 times in a row, I think not defend it, but just to sort of put it in context. The thing about NetHack is that it's a random game, and if you have a game that's unwinnable, then people tend to feel betrayed. Like, why should I have played that in the first place? So I think they've almost gone overboard to make sure that every situation is escapable in some way. From Elbereth to prayer to wishing, there's all these things that can be used to get out of trouble. I think they probably have gone a bit overboard in that regard. Prayer itself, once people find out that prayer and Elbereth both exist in the game, I think their life expectancy shoots up a lot. But on the other hand, you have to remember that these people who've won 3 times in a row, Marvin is, I think, the maintainer of the Atari ST port. These are like the foremost experts in NetHack. So, it might be arguable that maybe they should be able to win with such confidence. I don't know. I can see why the dev team would probably go overboard to make sure the situation is escapable, even if I wouldn't have designed it that way myself.
So Derek, just going back to SporkHack then, you obviously started off like that, removing some of the things that you didn't like from NetHack. Very brave, I must say. I know just how violently the community can react to things like, say, mountain dwarfs being removed from Crawl. Just to bring up a sore nerve for some people. But yeah, pudding farming from NetHack, I can see that would not go down well with everyone. Adom recently has had the same thing with some of its abuses being removed, and players getting very, you're ruining the game, blah, blah, blah. Although, thankfully, a lot of people have been very positive about the changes. Well, what's the current position of SporkHack? How's it been in the last few years? How's it really changed, and what's going on with it now?
I actually haven't spent any time developing it in the past few years. I actually moved away from it because, primarily for work reasons, is a great deal of the time I spent developing SporkHack and beating on the NetHack code itself was when I was actually doing work in an older C/C++ code base. And somewhere around 2009 or so, or about mid-2009, early 2010, I got moved to a different group at work that was working on the modern C# WCF WPF foundation. And I found rapidly that as much as I thought it was a clever idea to try to do both at once, that in fact it was actually causing both my coding to suffer to try to jump back and forth between languages on a near daily basis. And so I really ended up just really putting it informally putting it down for a little while, and then coming back and making a formal announcement that's like, I've stopped development, the public server can stay up, and this is where you can get the latest Windows release, this is where you can get the source code, and if you want to do anything with it, off you go, you have that. I definitely wanted to make sure not to make the same mistake the dev team did, which is to leave everything in an indefinite state while I went bicycling across Antarctica.
Okay, so what's the current state of SporkHack itself?
With regards to what? I'm not sure precisely what you're asking. I mean, right now it's still out there. I see there's still games being played on the public server. Not a whole lot of them, but people still play them. I know that it's included as one of the variants in the June Nethack tournament, so it gets a certain amount of attention there. But at this point, I wouldn't say that it's finished by a long shot, but I also would say that it has definitely it's certainly come a lot further than when I originally envisioned it. I've ended up changing rather a lot more, and of course I had Pasi's help on that as well. For that, I was able to include his level editor, his new the one that stands out to my mind is the new level creation system, and a number of the new features that he added that actually allowed a greater deal of, I don't want to say customization, but really control from the designer's perspective. You could do more clever things with custom levels after Pasi's engine went in than you ever could with the original vanilla NetHack engine.
Okay, and what other major changes are there compared to the original NetHack?
One of the biggest ones is I started ripping out, much like Patric did, I started ripping out as many insta-deaths as I could. I wanted to make things go back and be punishing, but not be just death. That it's like, okay, one of the biggest ones was the poison insta-deaths. Is you started losing where normally you would have gotten a poison insta-death, you start getting max hit point loss, and yeah, eventually that kills you. But it's just if you get unlucky once, you're not hosed. You're just severely disadvantaged, and you're gonna have a long way to go. But you at least aren't. You die. Beyond that, the next biggest changes I really went through, and I started curbing the abuses. Wishing I cut down sharply. Obviously, we just mentioned pudding farming. that was actually a fairly trivial fix, and it just caused a firestorm of people who are like, "How dare you do this?" Gehenna is probably one of the biggest changes I'd made, and I know I was the first person to just completely wholesale replace the way the Gehenna levels were designed. I wanted it to be rather than being the startlingly boring exercise in plotting that Gehenna was in vanilla, where it was entirely mazes, and this really worked to the advantage of the player because it meant that only one monster could attack him at a time. And by the time you'd reach Gehenna, there was no single monster in the game that was a match for the player. So what I really did is I wanted to open it up so the player was always in danger of being mobbed, and then I added a few environmental hazards just to make it look a little more like hell. Splashed lava everywhere, and so that was probably one of the bigger changes that I can think of. And then I started rewired elemental resistances to not be default binary, to where you eat something, eat a winter wolf at level 4 or 5. You could find a winter wolf and eat it and get cold resistance for the rest of the game, which just incidentally rendered one of the major demon lores completely meaningless. So I spent a lot of effort boosting the difficulty of the end game and trying to get rid of a lot of the ha-has in the early game.
Okay, sounds like to me sort of the ultimate version of NetHack, really. And
not
Patric,
everyone.
I know Patric has said that people have not liked it, and obviously Patric has his own vision of NetHack in terms of making his own extension of NetHack that isn't as extreme as yours. But yeah, I quite like the sound of everything you've done.
If only everyone else agreed with you, this would be much more convenient. And there obviously was a great deal of controversy, and I think to a great degree it was simply because I was the first one to really step forward and barbecue the sacred cow. I know I've said that before, but I mean, I think that really was a big part of it. And I will have to admit that I certainly didn't make any effort to be non-abrasive about it when I was simply not going to change my mind about something, and to some degree I did that simply because, and I wasn't abrasive specifically, but I probably presented a much more inflexible front than I really actually had, largely because I really didn't want people to get the idea that, well, hey, we just have to pester him and he'll change it back. I really wanted people to go and play the game and show me how it was broken, and then I'd say, well, okay, you're in the game actually beating it to death. All right, I've broken something, or in the game, like, okay, that's obviously much too hard, so hey, let's pull that back. So I really wanted to try to push people into doing that rather than just, as far too many people were prone to, is just making a post on Usenet and saying, well, here you go. I think this is terrible because, like, well, have you tried it? And usually the answer to that was no. So I was like, well, then I'm not listening anymore. So, and I'm sure that came off as far more abrasive than I intended it to, but I don't know. I don't know that I regret it particularly as much as just, I think somebody had to stand up to the community and say, this is the way this one's going to be. Now what?
I think it's a problem. Gamers are notoriously reactionary and don't like any change at all, unless it's just adding things or duplicating things or something like that. And we've seen that on a lot of roguelikes. It's probably part of the reason why Nethack became the way it was. This sort of whole kitchen sink thing is that any attempt to remove things would have gotten the same reaction that you got, Derek. Patrick, do you want to come in on that?
One of the problems if you do a Nethack fork and you make it more interesting is that this also most of the time means that the player will die more often, and usually they don't like that. And if you imagine a player dying in Gehenna after 3 or 4 hours of playing, when in Nethack he wouldn't have. This is a problem. You have to give the player something that he would accept this death. So Derek obviously didn't. So there are lots of players who didn't play SporkHack, unfortunately. And in my opinion, this is actually a problem with Nethack, that it is much too long. But this is kind of the design decisions you have to take. Do I make the game more interesting and more dangerous, or do I take another way and maybe cut down on the late game? Because usually a player in Nethack doesn't die after the castle. And up to the castle, it's an interesting game, and then we enter Gehenna, and nothing really can hurt the player, and it's actually quite boring until you start the Ascension run to win the game finally.
John?
Yeah, the length of Nethack, I think, is probably one of the greatest cause. I think I've mentioned before in a previous column or something, the longer a game gets, the more you have invested in it. And once you start getting to the hour mark, players start getting really adverse to dying and effectively wasting everything done up to that point in a game with permadeath. And Nethack usually takes like days to win. Players generally have a bad reaction if they die late in the game, which is probably why they don't focus too much on keeping the difficulty that late. Yeah, the whole game can be shortened, and Gehenna is probably, as Derek has correctly identified, a huge part of that, where it's just a long slog. It's just maze after maze after maze, maybe like 25 of them. And a part of it is sort of like reducing the distance you'll have to travel once you get the amulet and can no longer level teleport. But even that's kind of, boring. And so I wholeheartedly approve of anything to shorten Gehenna. The reason the mazes are in there, though, should be said, is that it's probably historical. The very first version of Hack had the mazes in hell. And so every version since then, I think, has sort of felt, maybe among the dev team, traditional pressure to keep them in, when they probably should have been abandoned or at least severely reduced a long time ago.
It's something we talked about on a recent episode, actually. It's that almost every major roguelike has a maze level in there somewhere. And it always seems to be just so the coders can say, look, I made a maze code thing, and that's the only reason. Look, I can do procedural mazes. Gameplay-wise, it's utterly anathema to roguelike gameplay to have just corridors. It's just, mazes are the most boring thing you can have in a game.
Oh, and every first-person shooter has a sewer level. Every adventure has its own variant of a maze, where with the directions randomized. I think there's an example for almost every game type. It's unfortunately just that for roguelikes, it appears to be great big corridor mazes, or maybe Nethack-like.
I don't think the corridor mazes are even particularly bad, because they're very different fight-in style and tactics that you need to do for them. It's just 25 levels of them, which is ridiculous. If there's like one level of mazes, then you just adopt it and work with it. It's like the big room, right? If you had 25 levels of big rooms, we'd be talking about how stupid big rooms are. When you have one of them, it's actually kind of an interesting break or change.
Well, I think big rooms is an interesting thing, because if you compare big rooms, funnily enough, it's the least procedural type of level generation you get, but a big room in a roguelike is a huge challenge. It's like one of the most interesting things in Powder. When you get to the big room, it's like, oh fuck, oh fuck, oh fuck. There's a real sort of panic trying to get through that. A maze is just kind of, you're always wondering what's around the corner, but if it's late in the game especially, you're powerful enough that you don't have to worry too much.
Well, it's really, in my mind, it should be a chance for Wand of Diggins to shine, where you just, blast through a whole bunch of walls and quickly cut your way through, to sort of like reward the player and let them feel powerful, of like, oh, look at this maze, but I can bypass it with my skills. And that's why when we then decide to do stuff to turn off their ability to bypass mazes, we've forgotten what they really should be there for.
Yeah, so many games which have roguelikes make them no teleport levels with no digging levels with indestructible walls. And you're like, they force you to do the maze. It's just painful. And I think it's one of those examples of developers not playing their games and not actually seeing just how boring these things are.
The best Nethack players actually stashed Wands of Digging for the entire game for exactly that reason, by the way. Go ahead.
Yes, but they stashed the Wand of Diggings because Wand of Diggings in Gehenna only remove one wall. They are limited in Gehenna to not act like a normal Wand of Digging.
Exactly, and that's sort of like the no luck in Sokoban of being like, why?
Yes.
John, I understand you've got to go soon. Have you got any final points before you disappear?
Yes, I just wanted to say one thing about how variants haven't, sort of been perceived as picking up the mantle from the dev team yet. In addition to, of course, the dev team occasionally feebly mentioning they're not done yet. Also, I think there's the case where most variants have sort of taken the job to fix, problem with Nethack, which is, of course, a valid thing. But I think everyone's still sort of looking at the dev team to figure out the next direction the game should go. It's like, when the change from Nethack 3.0 to 3.1 added a huge amount of stuff to the game. Things like the quest dungeon, changing the whole nature of hell, adding in the sanctum and things like that. And I don't think a lot of variants have yet sort of taken that approach to sort of strike out new ground, to come up with whole new systems to put in. Like when the dev team added weapon skills, and it caused, those types of code-heavy additions to the game. I think sort of like Angband and has sort of done this more positively because Tome has taken Angband, turned into something entirely different, and arguably better. And I think possibly the variant that does that, the Nethack, finds the new ground, come up with something incredible, new way to improve the game, instead of just sort of fixing things that have gone before, adding just things like new levels and items. I think that might be the thing, or at least to actually take Nethack and take it into a new maybe a new game. In any case, I have to go.
Okay, thank you, John, for joining us. It's been very nice having you talk about Nethack. I know it's a big passion for you.
Yeah, well, it's a nice game. I know probably a little too much about it. Any case, thank you, everyone. I'll catch you later sometime. Good night.
All right, just to pick up on something that John said earlier about the length of Nethack. Before Nethack, most roguelikes, as far as I know, were much, much shorter. I'm wondering, was it the start of the kind of long game roguelikes? Does anyone know?
Well, Angband was long at the same time, wasn't it? Angband took Moria 50 levels and doubled it to 100, if I remember properly.
And Hack was already 50 levels.
Hack was already 50 levels, okay.
25 normal rooms, similar to Nethack now, and then 25 mazes.
I wonder if perhaps Nethack was the first to have these different branches and things of the different thematic areas and such, and this way of kind of this approach to the dungeon design of just adding more bits to the dungeon.
At least Larn,
Go ahead.
probably in the whole game, but Larn already had those two different branches where you had the town at the top and the normal dungeon, and then when you go to, what was it, you get a medicine for your daughter or something like that, you go down the volcano.
Yeah, okay, so possibly it wasn't the first, though. I suppose it's the one that kind of gets known for some of these things. Omega also had multiple branches. Well, Omega was a nice game, unfortunately no longer with us. Well, you can still play it, but...
We forget that the roguelikes have been around a long time, and in the 80s you didn't only have the hack and the bands, but you also have Larn, Omega, some that you don't remember because almost nobody played. Back in the day when I first met Nethack, it was on a public domain disc on the Amiga, and it wasn't. I wasn't particularly impressed because it wasn't graphical and it wasn't special because I already have met other roguelikes or games that looked similar to this. I didn't know at that time that what a roguelike was. And I think in the 90s there was a time when only Angband and Nethack was around, and this shaped our view of history. The other games just died out because they didn't get developed anymore. But those two that went along and became what we think of now as archetypical roguelikes.
Yeah, it used to be that they said that the major roguelikes were Rogue, Maria, Larn, Omega, Hack, and then there came the next generation of Nethack, Adom, Angband, Crawl, and now it's kind of like some of them are still kind of around, but it's much more diverse now.
In some ways, there was a big extinction event around in the 90s, which left only like these two branches left over, which then causes us to retcon and say there's either hack-likes or bands, but it's partly because those were the two that really survived, and then we branched out off again now.
Yeah, very much.
Although I'm not sure we're branching all that much. I think the hack variants are all actually starting to converge again. They spread out with Spork, UnNethack, NitroHack, AceHack, and now it's really all starting to merge back together. Un picked up a whole bunch of features from Spork and from Nitro, and I know you were doing the same thing with NetHack 4, and it's picked up a bunch of features from Ace and Nitro as well. So I wonder if we're seeing everything re-merge back together into the stream to where it'll finally be able to take over as well. Someone will have to want to take over, of course, but if somebody actually wants to, if they could end up being the NetHack 4.
I think I was referring to more generic term of variants, so stuff like Powder is a NetHack variant, and Adom is almost a NetHack variant. I believe it also has a strong Omega background to it.
Oh, okay.
I think also across the roguelike genre, there's less of a sense of games being kind of stuck in this path of being like this or like that. Adom, now that it's had redevelopment, has had players from across the roguelike spectrum playing it, and players that have no roguelike history, or very little roguelike history, or have only played Adom playing it and pointing out ways it could improve and ways it can change that are very different. And also, to a large extent, influenced by Crawl and a lot of its kind of optimization and removing scumming and that sort of thing. A lot of that ethos has come into Adom now. Tome, with its move away from Angband, it's got a few kind of hallmarks, but ultimately is very much its own thing, and it takes a lot of completely new ideas and strips a lot of things out, and takes ideas from other genres entirely. Still has much of its own thing, and Rogue has much of its own thing. I think we're seeing lots of kind of maybe things that will start their own branches in the future, but actually I think probably not. I think we're at a stage now where people are looking at the gaps instead of looking at ways to extend the branch. They're looking at where there are no branches. So what we're seeing is, instead of this branch structure, we're seeing like a scatter chart. We're seeing lots of things. And I think people are beginning to realize more, especially with the 7-day roguelikes and a lot more experimentation in design. People are seeing that you don't have to be so rigid in your structure of your game and your definition of what is a roguelike. It has to have 1,000 items, that sort of thing. It has to have these interactions. It has to have this type of monster. It has to have this type of dungeon. We're seeing people looking for the gaps and looking for how to make their game different. And in a way, I think we've seen the death of bans and hack likes and any sort of likes. We're seeing a much richer wealth of games and things that are between genres like FTL and so on, doing utterly new things, which is all, in my opinion, very positive.
Well, if you don't try to write the next Nethack or the next Angband, you have a much easier job to do.
That brings up an important point, the idea of trying to write the next Nethack, which, we talked about people trying to take over the Nethack line, but what has more often happened is people trying to write a game that is to Nethack what Nethack was to Hack, or what Nethack was to Rogue. Trying to make a bigger, ultimate, beefier, better roguelike that does everything. It has the kitchen sink and the plumbing and everything. It has the simulation of muscle mass in the attack system and all sorts of complexities. And a big thing we've seen over the last 20 years is that when people decide they want to write a completely new roguelike, they end up trying to make something that is Nethack plus extras. That Nethack is their starting point, and they want to make something bigger. And this has been a big approach of many people, and it's led to a lot of misguided, in my opinion, attempts at making new games. Because they can't see beyond the idea of a big, ultra-complex roguelike. That with Nethacks as the starting point, they can't help but think of doing something bigger. Do you want to come in, David?
So to this day, it still happens that people talk about Nethack as the roguelike. And this is actually one of the things that I hate about Nethack. So as I said, Nethack has some good things for it, and there are a lot of design issues that I could go on for forever, but I won't. But it is really a problem to me if people point at Nethack and say this is what a roguelike should be. And this is not just hypothetical blurb. Just the other day there was a YouTube video, The History of Rogue, and it's very well done, and I can give you the link so that you can watch it. And they talk about Diablo and other things, but the only pure breed roguelike that they show is Nethack, and somehow I think this is bad, because if I would point a new player to the genre, I would give them Rogue or Doom roguelike or something, and never Nethack. Nethack is so unplayable. I just did it. I just went while we talked. I went to Sukuban again. The interface is much worse, and it's so obfuscated. So this is something that I really don't like, and we should try to get new players into different things than Nethack. So this is what I have to say.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Absolutely couldn't agree more. But one thing I would say is that it still has players, it still has fans, and it still has new players that come along and start it and play it and win it. And many of the things that you said, I would say the same about, say, Dwarf Fortress, and yet it's still popular. I think there's sometimes a disconnect between what we as developers like and what players like. That a lot of the things like bad interface, over complexity, requirements of spoilers, bad design, awful design, hideous design, players don't care.
Well, requirement of spoilers is a nice feature, because as a player, you feel very clever when you know all these secret handshakes to go through the club, right? And so I think that's why a lot of people like the spoilers and like the spoiler-based area, because then every time you know to do this particular thing to get out of this instant death, you're like, oh, I'm so clever, yay.
Yeah, I agree. There's a sense of community there that the different secrets and other players know the different secrets. And when someone new comes in, you can appear as a very knowledgeable person. One thing about Nethack in particular is that with this whole interactions between everything, it almost goes beyond being a game. It becomes a toy. It becomes a toy rather than a game. It becomes something that you can play with and be inventive with. We see all sorts of things about players doing conduct runs or doing special challenges and things like that. And they can only do that because it has so many complex interactions and so many weird ways of doing things. I think some of the other big roguelikes share the same thing. Adom, for instance. People have won it in ways that Thomas Biskup thought would not be possible at all. That he's surprised that people could do this at all. And I think players like that. It speaks to the longevity of the game, that people can still be playing to this day and still finding new ways to have fun with it, even though they have all the source code and all the spoilers and so on. That Nethack is a sandbox in a way that different from how modern day sandboxes are, with giving you a big environment to play in. It gives you a depth of interactions to play with, and that means that you get more than just the infinite content in this sort of the random nature of the game, but you get this wealth of interactions that not everyone cares about winning. They care about all the weird things you can do instead.
You can't care about winning if you never do it. There are lots of NetHack players who have never won, even though if you... we talked earlier about the ascension rates. If you spoil yourself to the death, we have players that have started to play NetHack and won after 2 or 3 weeks. If you are really dedicated and don't care about spoilers, then you can get to win this game rather fast.
And yet people don't, because they muck about in it and they have fun and they laugh when things go wrong and they die in a stupid way.
Yes.
And there's people that enjoy that.
Jeff,
I think you've got to go. If you got any final points to say before you disappear?
Not much. You guys are covering it quite beautifully. Just I think this is a very good point about NetHack becoming the face of roguelikes. And as I said, that's what I defined roguelikes was by what NetHack was. And then you look at stuff like Diablo and you think it's not a roguelike because it's not NetHack. But it is like Rogue, or stuff like Spelunky or Rogue Legacy. There's other things that form roguelikes than what we see in NetHack. So thank you very much for inviting me here.
It's great to have you on. Take care of yourself, Jeff. Going back to David's point and what Jeff was saying about the face of roguelikes being NetHack, I can understand perfectly the kind of your anger, David, of that when you get a show that talks about roguelikes as a whole and they represent old roguelikes, the only example that gets shown is NetHack. And when you speak to people about roguelikes and you talk about classic roguelikes, the only example they know is NetHack, with all of its warts, all of its terrible warts, in particular its user interface. That is a big thing, because NetHack has one of the worst of all the classical interfaces. Its inventory system I find utterly impenetrable. Its extension of key presses that are required. All the other sort of problems, some of which we get in a lot of roguelikes, but NetHack I think is particularly bad. And when someone thinks roguelike and looks it up and finds NetHack and tries to play it, it immediately puts a sort of bad name across all of the other stuff which is done much better, like Crawl, like Tome, like Brogue. So yeah, as a representation of this is what classical roguelikes are like, NetHack is not a good modern example. Pasi?
Well, NetHack isn't modern anymore. It is 10 years old.
It's even more than 10 years old. If you look at the releases of NetHack, you will see that the majority of the releases happened before 1996. The most active time of development of NetHack was around 89 to 93. And this interface hasn't changed almost since then. And of course it shows.
And it used to be the thing that, this was a kind of learning curve to the game. But especially in modern times, people expect a good interface. It doesn't matter how sort of obscure your game is. People expect to be able to pick up and play it. I think Dwarf Fortress manages to buck that trend a little bit, but even that isn't as... No, it probably is as bad as NetHack, actually.
More. I tried to get into Dwarf Fortress. I spent several hours with tutorials and I couldn't get anything started.
It has a lot of inconsistency between what does what. Like the advanced message buffer is different. It's a different key depending on which message buffer it is, and all sorts of issues like that. NetHack is at least mostly consistent with its interface. But it's just when you compare it to Dungeon Crawl or to Brogue, and Dungeon Crawl isn't that great in all areas, but it's still much better than NetHack. And yeah, it's not what we would want as an ambassador for the genre.
That's also one of the reasons why I added the new curses interface to the alt.org server. So it would be a slightly better, easier to use for new players.
So what's the main difference with that?
It's mainly a modern curses UI for the game. Even though the code of NetHack is not the best and it's old C code, the separation between the gaming engine and the window UI code is well enough that is actually quite good for this old code. So you can rather easily make a new UI. And there are various different UIs, and one of those is a curses UI that is in UnNethack on the NethackAlt.org public server. which is slightly better than the old console version. But of course, it's not the old ASCII console version, so the hardcore players won't play it. But it is not a problem because you can have it both beside each other, and you don't need anything special to do.
Okay. I think a lot of us could probably go on a lot of things that we don't like about Nethack. An important thing to remember is that this is very popular with a lot of players still. What do we think are the big good points of Nethack? Why do we think it has this lasting appeal? Patrick?
I wanted to go back to the interface for a second.
Okay, go ahead.
The interface is nowadays a real problem if you want to play it on your smartphone or your tablet or on a browser. The Stone Soup has a nice browser version. I would love to have something similar for UnNethack, but unfortunately I don't. And the tablet version, of course, this is not a problem only with Nethack. All old roguelikes have this problem. If you go on a tablet, you don't have a keyboard. And those old roguelikes had lots and lots of different key interface issues. But I think you covered that nicely already in the mobile roguelike episode.
Yeah, and we've talked before about how mobiles are becoming a bigger thing. Touchscreen is becoming a bigger method of control for computing in general. I believe the latest statistics are that tablet computers are now outselling traditional desktops. It's only a matter of time, I think, before we're not going to have this traditional input interface anymore, especially as things get more mobile. Things like numpads are disappearing. So a lot of these old roguelikes, simply through interface, will not be playable anymore.
Yeah,
Derek?
I do wish that Jeff Lait was still here on that, because he has a very unique perspective on on how to simplify a NetHack-like interface. Because his roguelike Powder was of course written originally for the Game Boy Advance. So what he had to work with was a D-pad, 2 buttons, and sort of 2 shoulder buttons. So he really did a good job with that as far as the direction you could go to slim NetHack down to make it accessible to the mobile. But I do think that it'd certainly be something I'd like to see, is attempting to drag NetHack over onto a mobile, or really onto a tablet would be better. I don't know that I'd want to play it on my phone. But it's talk about heavy lifting. I mean, it's heavy lifting just to clean up the NetHack code, much less get it into a form that would work on even just an Android tablet.
I thought there was a version.
I think there is a version, but if someone please correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think the version doesn't try to get rid of the plethora of separate keys or separate commands for separate actions. I think it pushes it behind a menu.
It's pure. It is just a straight over port, and it's not very playable in my opinion.
There are 2 versions. I think one is a little more better tablified than the other one. The one that doesn't do it as well has the keys at the bottom of the screen, and you can scroll through. You can customize which keys you want in what order, and then you can scroll through those. So it's a straight port in that sense, yes. But the other one is a bit more nicely, but you have to try it. Both are free on the Android market.
Okay, I remember hearing that a big issue is having to zoom in and out all the time. You got to zoom in to see the action around you, and then zoom out to see the overall dungeon, and you're constantly in this state of zooming in, zoom out, move, zoom in, zoom out, move. It gets a bit tedious to play, I've heard. Some sort of mini-map would obviously help with that. I think that in terms of updating that sort of interface, I think Powder does the quite nice thing of having the different shortcuts around the edge of the screen, and Tome 4 does a similar thing of it. It abstracts everything out into some form of action which you can have in the bar at the bottom. So you've got an action bar of things you can do, and some of them have timeouts and stuff. And activating an item or using a special ability to do with your class, or using a spell, or using all these different things are all just icons at the bottom of your bar, and you just tap any of those, and that would work very well if it ever got out onto tablets, I think. Plus, I think there's probably more things. I think Ploog, I've heard, has a great iPad version, but I don't have an iThingy. But yeah, Nethack would be particularly fiendish to move over in a good way without some extensive redesigning of elements. I think you'd have to make an iNethack or something that actually changes the game significantly to actually suit mobile play.
Or just tackle the problem as basically just admit that you're going to rewrite everything from scratch, and just make sure that your development group and your initial alpha testing group are people that really know Nethack backwards and forwards. Because if you're going to do a rewrite and try to maintain the majority of the interactions, or at least the ones that are particularly funny or particularly clever, then you're really going to need someone there to say, hey, what about this corner case thing? Because Nethack is, as I think it was Patric that said, it's special case, and the other way around is just it's corner case hack. Everything has a one use over in the corner somewhere.
Yeah, which doesn't always lend itself well to a good interface. Patric, do you want to... Oh, sorry, did you have a point?
I was just going to say all the keys on the keyboard are in use. They had to start looking for new ones.
Yes, and if you have every item has usually more than one use. Even a cream pie, you can eat a cream pie, you can throw a cream pie, you can wield it so that if you accidentally hit somebody else, it doesn't count as an attack, and your pacifist conduct doesn't get broken. All those... Nethack is extremely focused on such things, and getting that into a limited UI with limited input methods is extremely hard. I think you can't put it on a smartphone-sized device and get it to run correctly. A tablet could possibly work, although those that are in existence could be better, I think.
I think it would have to change much of how it makes things very verb-based with the interface to make it much more centered on the items and the monsters. So you'd have to select the item and then the interaction you want to do with the item through some sort of menu then that pops up, rather than choosing an interaction type you want and then choosing the item you want to use. But there's still a big challenge there. Patric, did you want to talk about the community?
We already said that a lot of people have met Nethack in their life, but not all of them are part of the community. Most of the online community gathers around the public servers. That means you can use SSH or Telnet to log into a server and play the ASCII version there. And the biggest one is the one that is administered by Pasi, nethack.org. Usually you can always go there and watch somebody play, and if you go on IRC on Freenode in #Nethack, you also will see that the deaths of the people are announced there, so you can always have a good laugh or be sad. It depends what you want when a player dies, or sometimes people come in and ask what they can do, and then they get help. This is also the guy that I mentioned before that only did Ascend in 3 weeks, had a lot of input from the community, because this is Nethack is not a game where you can get stuff like this easily, and getting help from other people is a tremendous help and makes it much more easier to get along in this game. Currently there's also the Dev Null tournament going on for, I think, a week. There you play also on public servers and die a lot and get some achievements. We covered Dev Null and the UnNethack tournament in the tournament episode of Roguelike Radio already, so I don't want to talk a lot about that.
It's probably worth reminding people about the UnNethack tournament and how they can play that, including the variants.
The UnNethack is always on in June and uses the existing public servers, so you don't have to go to a special one. You only have to find one of the public servers of the actively. Not all variants are actively developed. I'm looking at Derek here, but. we will link the public servers of those that are part of the Nethack community. And the big problem with all those is you have to like to play in the ASCII versions, because we don't have the luxury of a graphical online version.
Which leads immediately to the question of perhaps people have talked a lot about doing that type of thing, is splitting it out into a real server client, and I know that Ace 213 has talked about doing exactly that as well, and I think he's actually made some work towards it. I would have to say I'd wonder if that might not be the best approach, one of the good approaches is build a graphical Java client or a graphical client of some kind that could connect to alt.org and play. So you would have a Tiles graphical version that you could throw into a browser, or that you could throw as a separate exe if you wanted to go that route. But it's just interesting to kind of explore into it. It seems to be just. I think we've kind of drifted over a little bit into just trying to bring what would it take to bring NetHack up to modern standards? Because I think, as Darren went down the road a little bit earlier, and then we kind of derailed on it, was that we definitely think there are still plenty of good things about NetHack. One of which being that you can do everything with everything piece, but it's definitely a question of trying to see if it's possible to get new blood is one way to put it, but just try to make sure that it comes up a little bit more towards modern.
Pasi?
I'm considering my own role as the admin of alt.org as trying to give CPR to NetHack, so that as long as the dev team doesn't release a new version, or until someone else steps up and becomes the next NetHack, the alt.org server is still keeping the NetHack community alive and trying to keep it going forward.
One of the problems we are having is actually that I think probably we just don't know what it would take to, the way the NetHack community is now is not so bad for that it hasn't been, that there hasn't been a release for 10 years of the original NetHack. We have some forks that are more or less active and more or less thriving even. Maybe it's just the problem that NetHack is so big that no fork, and not in these days where there are much more roguelikes like FTL and Dwarf Fortress and all those others, probably a next NetHack can't ever be built because it would have to be as impressive as NetHack was in the days gone. And this is probably not going to happen.
The interesting thing is that some people consider the alt.org NetHack as a variant, even though I've tried to keep the core gameplay vanilla, only adding bug fixes and stuff like that. I don't want to say that alt.org NetHack is the next NetHack, because I'm still quietly hoping that the dev team will continue and release the next NetHack.
Really? Oh, isn't that cute? Sorry.
Your optimism is refreshing.
Well, someone has to be an optimist here.
David, just to go back to you, what's your sort of history with NetHack? Because I understand you used to be a big fan, but you're not so positive about it these days.
Yeah, I can tell you. So when I was a pupil, so maybe at the age of 15 or so, somebody gave me a disc, a 144 floppy disk, and it had NetHack on it, and they told me play it, and then at home I did it, and I never saw a game with an ASCII interface before, so I have a certain penchant for strange things, and then I immediately loved it, and then I gave it to my sister, so who was JPEG, and then we both played it, and we wrote our own spoilers, which were completely wrong because they were not based on the source. We just wrote them, and we had a lot of fun with it. And yeah. So, and then after a while, we discovered the Usenet channel for NetHack, and then we posted our our victory posts, our ascension posts, and so on. And then we took part in the ubiquitous discussions of what to change about Nethack and discussing all the design flaws, and realized nothing would ever happen. And then for some reason, Johanna and I had some particular gripe about Nethack. And maybe I can say this because this is one of the things that's not done like this anymore. When you start Nethack, then you are greeted with a wall of text. I have no idea when was the last time that you ever read the creation myth about Marduk and Moloch. Must have been a long time ago. Usually the game starts, you click it away, and then nobody cares. It's not relevant to the game at all. And so this wall of text basically accomplishes nothing. I think it's one of the D&D legacies. And whatever, when you go to the quest, something similar happens. You get a wall of text, a screen full, and it's actually interesting because they tell you something about how your home level is being corrupted, and it should be interesting. And then you go there, and then you see, for example, on the Valkyrie quest level, those giants, but they are happily standing next to the to the locals, and it doesn't make any sense with the text you read before. You see, this is urgent sounding, and you should do something to rescue your friends and relatives, and then you go there, and then there's the enemies are there next to each other, and nothing happens. So this is not how it should be. And then I came up with something, and Johanna coded it, and then the idea was that first of all so those invaders actually attack the locals, and of course the quest leader would be sacrosanct; he would not be killed. But if you manage to kill all the invaders and save as many locals as possible, you would get a small reward. And we thought this would be very Nethacky. And then Johanna proposed this, and there's actually code to support this, and it basically, so it's a working patch. And then nobody was interested. Nobody showed any interest in the flavor deficit that we perceived, and nobody cared about the patch at all. And then so we faded away from Nethack. And then 2 years later, Johanna showed me about Crawl. So this was before Stone Soup, and then we never looked back. And then later on, I realized that very many of the Stone Soup developers had precisely this experience. So Eric and Darshan and Haran, we all came from Nethack, and Darshan also wrote something and nobody cared. And then, so I think this lack of an active leadership actually meant that Nethack has lost a lot of good potential helpers or coders or patchers.
Yes, this is also an issue because we had always the dev team, and getting into the dev team was hard. Getting into the Stone Soup developer group is easy. Anybody they give out commit access like candy.
True.
So the usual way to get code into Nethack was to develop a patch, and then maybe this patch was discussed, and maybe even a few people played it with a version they compiled themselves. And some of the dev team members thought this is a nice idea and put it into the code. And of course, now that the dev team doesn't do this anymore, actually they haven't done lots of this for a long time. The real gameplay changes that were really important were probably in 3.2. And since then, mostly bug fixes and some levels. So they haven't done their job for a long time.
I think the last two significant versions for NetHack were 3.1.3 and 3.3.1 respectively. Yeah, you know what? I suppose 3.4.3 would be, but it hasn't been around as long. Those are certainly the first two are the version numbers that I remember for the vast majority of while I was aware of NetHack. It's just those were the ones that I know the major changes went in not on those versions, but in slightly earlier ones. But those were the ones that were stable and stuck around for a long time.
I suppose there's an interesting element of kind of project management when it comes to a big multi-author open source project. How do you keep this sustained across a long period of time? And the Crawl dev team has managed this, but the Nethack dev team hasn't.
I believe part of that was because they did have a very good leader in Patric Mueller. And when he died, I think the development stalled. So I think they may be lacking leadership.
Yeah. Do you want to talk more about? Someone want to talk more about Ischak? I don't know, but it sounds like it's worth getting some good mention of him.
I don't know that any of us really knew Ischak at all. Certainly, my only experience with him is as a shopkeeper in Minetown. But I think that Pasi is dead on this, actually, because you can almost trace back. Yeah, Ishchak died prior to 3.2, and his memorial was put into one of the 3.2 releases. But I strongly suspect that Ishchak, partly being a leader to provide direction, and partly I think it was very possible that he was the only person who could bring the dev team to consensus on any given thing. Pasi, I don't know if you remember, we talked a long time ago, and it just occurred to me on this that we had spoken with one, or I think you had spoken with one of the dev team members, and they pretty much admitted that, hey, not everybody agrees on things. And I think there was an unspoken one there that nobody agrees, and there's nobody who's willing to step in and say, okay, we're going to do it this way, and because we've got to do something. So I think they've been in a state of disagreement on direction, probably a great big disagreement on coding as to what needs to be coded and what needs to be done. And yeah, I think you could really trace it back to that, is without Ishchak, there really weren't very many major changes made.
That's very interesting from a historical perspective, and it's sad that Ishchak passed away at such a pivotal time in Nethack's development. When you compare it to Crawl, David, I know there isn't exactly a leader with the Crawl dev team, but you have acted as that to a great extent. I know you're not sort of dictatorial with the team, but you do act as a sort of grouping together for a direction and a voice for where it should go. If you look at other big roguelikes, Adam obviously has one central leader, and when that leader was, it's closed source, obviously, so when he wasn't active, nothing happened. But the implementation of player ideas and so on has required a central leader on that. For Tome 4, only one person controls the source. Lots of people submit patches, but again, it has one strong leader who keeps it going. And I think we see this across a lot of successful projects. A strong, opinionated leader that is able to keep things going in one direction is pretty vital for keeping a project alive. And Nethack hasn't had that in a very long time.
So yes, leadership is certainly important, and one of the things that we learned in Crawl from the Nethack debacle is that you should try to open out for fresh blood, and so this is what we did. This is the Patric says candy, but to me it's a gateway drug. So if somebody sends in a decent patch, then they get combat access, and then they will write more patches, and this is good. And this is only one thing. The other thing I believe that is really important is that the group, or at least enough members of the group, have a vision of what you want to do. So with Dungeon Crawl, we have established this. There is a design document, and of course you can disagree on this or that, and that's completely fine. But on the whole, people do agree on what we want in the game. And I would think that in Adam and Tome, there's something just like this for Incursion. I've seen a design statement. For Nethack, I'm not sure if something like this ever really has existed, and this is perhaps part of the problem. When then a crucial person cannot code anymore, then you are stuck in the dark.
Yeah, and Kroll had it from Lindley's days, I believe.
No, this is not really. So I wrote it, but so I wrote down what I think Lindley meant with his design, and then we had something and we talked about it. But I think this design document really helped. It also helps with the players, because players really refer to this, and they understand what Crawl is about, and that nerfing and removing things is important. And Nethack never had any of this.
Yes, I definitely think with the player base, it's important to set up expectations.
Yeah.
This is what this game is about. Don't expect more. Tome, I think, quite early on said that it would be cutting things out, and so when it came to removing all consumable items from the game, there was an outcry. But then there was a lot of supporting voices saying, "No, this fits in perfectly with the design vision of the game." And even with Adam, when it was revived, Thomas Bishop said, "I'm going to be trying to modernize it to keep up with the likes of Tome and Crawl." And so there was a lot of support when he did make changes, saying this fits in with the declared vision. So stating up front, this is the long-term strategy for the development, really helps keep players on board with any changes that you make. But yeah, Nethack, I don't think, has had much other than add things in that seem appropriate at the time. Derek and Patrick, did you have specific visions for when you're branching away, or was it more do what feels right at the time?
I know. I did. That was actually the first one of the first pieces on the website. Well, I hesitate to call it a website because I don't have mad HTML skills, so it's really just kind of a web page. But that was really one of the first things I wrote was for myself was the design concept, which was really just what direction am I going to go with this? What am I going to try to do, and what do I want to accomplish in the first place? And I think that really helped as far as, every so often you're sitting there looking at what you're about to do and you're like, does this even remotely fit with the direction I was going in when I started all this? And sometimes you say yes, sometimes you say no, sometimes you throw it in there anyway just to see what'll happen, knowing that okay, if it's really that bad I can pull it back out, or if this doesn't do what I think it will, which was occasionally the case, then I'll pull it back out.
As it was fashionable to do a design document, I also had to do one. So I did a short one which only highlighted the most important things I thought were important. I didn't write a wall of text like David did. In my case, I only said stuff like it is better to be random than to not to be random. Nethack is meant to be hard. It should be challenging at every step. If you go through those maybe 16 or 20 lines, there are various things where you can say UnNethack hasn't achieved this, and I would immediately say yes, and I would also immediately say patches welcome, because I also give out commit access like candy. We have now a team of 6 or 7 people. Pasi is one of them. Derek, if he would still be coding, would also be in there, but he stepped down. Also because nowadays he doesn't do C anymore, and then it is better to not code in C if you don't have training.
Plus, if I don't have commit access, I can't blame anything on the people that do.
I think a design document doesn't need to be a long thing. It can just be some top-level statements of intent of sort of philosophies behind what you want the game to be, this versus that. But yeah, it's definitely helpful, especially if you're branching away from an existing game, or your focus is a bit like David was saying, away from Nethack was much of the kind of the crawl focus was we don't want to be like that. And it's important to write down what are the actual things. It's important to write down what are the things that are wrong that you want to fix or that you want to be different from. I wonder if a lot of the bands have that. But then a lot of the bands are more just reskinning it to a different theme, isn't it?
I've lost track of how many bands there are, so beats me.
And most of Angband is grinding. This is also a one-line design document.
Yep. I know Sil has some core design principles like that.
Make the numbers bigger. Make the numbers bigger.
And yet, Tome, when it started, the Dark God made a very specific thing of we're not going to have giant numbers. So whenever it actually started creeping into high damage levels, he downscaled all the numbers across the back end of the code, which was a big effort, but it made, just going through and chopping all the numbers down by 25%. It helped the game sort of stick with that central design vision. And a lot of players cried out at the time, this is stupid, this is too much effort than it's worth, just give us big numbers. And he was like, no, that's not what it's about. And it's good to see developers writing that sort of thing and sticking to it, I think. And Kroll certainly always stuck with his controversial decisions when they've happened. Yes, so have you, Derek, obviously.
Maybe a little.
Okay, we've been talking for 3 hours now. Are there any other major points people would like to raise?
I think I've managed to weasel all of mine in at some point or other.
Pasi, there's been a fair few comments from others on things they don't like about Nethack, but obviously you still run the server. You must still have some passion for the game. What do you think about all the criticisms of Nethack versus what you actually like about the game?
Actually, I do agree with most of the criticisms, and frankly, I don't play the game very much anymore. Like Patrick said, it's much more fun to develop than play. And when you do develop, you usually don't have very much time to actually play the game. I'm not quite sure. I think my main inspiration for keeping NetHack alive is the community. So that if there were no active players on the server, I wouldn't bother keeping it alive. I don't really know if there's anything that I'd to put it this way, I just wish the dev team would either die away or do something.
Okay, well, give up. Maybe not die, but say we're sorry, it's over. How do you think players feel? Players that do keep playing this. What draws them back? Do you think?
I have no idea. Maybe it's all the new stuff I've added on the server, but really I have no idea why people come back.
Anyone have any insights on that? On why people will keep playing?
So I believe people are coming back to NetHack for nostalgic reasons. If you have been around for a while as a NetHack player, and chances are that you have been, say, 5 or 10 years or even longer, then it's very good to know that this one thing will not change. Commercial games will fade by usually 2 years, maybe 5 if they're really long-lasting. Indie games may change drastically, but NetHack will not change. I think this is a virtue in itself, and this is why NetHack on Pasi server will hopefully always thrive. I myself would be really happy if we had a nice new version of NetHack, at least as far as the interface goes, because then people can always experience this and say, this is what one classical piece of a roguelike is. You can still play it and you can have fun. I did it. And it's a nice experience. So I wish all the best luck to you guys. I think you are the only ones keeping it alive.
I agree with David that old loves die hard, but I don't think that all of the players are old greybeards that have programmed on old vaccines or something like that.
And their children.
Yes?
The greybeards and their children.
Yeah, okay. I think it's rather simple that NetHack offers something that other games just don't offer players. Maybe I think NetHack is a little bit different than most other roguelikes. One thing is that you have the high interaction with items. Every item has more than one use. If you die, it's most often at least the game. If you look at what you had when you die, you often see I could have survived, and so you have you see it as a challenge and you want to try it again. And next time maybe you are not as dumb and you won't die to something you don't have to. I think this is of course a roguelike trait that people die mercilessly in such games, but I think that NetHack has that a little bit better balance than other games. I don't think FTL is a roguelike, but I think dying in FTL is quite similar to dying in NetHack. And from that, I also like to play FTL because it's such wonderful deaths that you can have in those games. And maybe that's one of the reasons why people come back, because it's not too easy. You can't just play it in one run and win. You have to challenge yourself and you have to better yourself, and finally when you see everything like in the Matrix, you can finally ascend, and then the nostalgia kicks in, and then you come back to play it once a year or maybe more.
Well, I think that's probably everything covered now.
One final point for those history buffs, there is a nice website on the internet that posts Usenet postings that are 30 years old. So right now you can relive the days of when Rogue was new. You have to use a newsreader, a Usenet newsreader. Most people don't know what this is. But it's rather fun to see that even 30 years ago they had problems that are quite similar to what they have 20 years later. And it's not yet hack. This will be in, I think, 2 years. The first hack postings will appear, but also the rogue postings are really fun to read and relive history in that sense.
Sounds fantastic. It's like Big Brother through time.
Yes.
What's this thing called?
Olduse.net. It's of course a wordplay because computer science people always like wordplays that are awful.
Okay, alt.use.net.
No, only olduse.net.
Alt.use. Okay. If you can give me a link to that, I will get that up in the chat, or a link to some instructions for how to get on it, at least. Because that does sound really quite funny. Alright, well, I think we're going to wrap it up there on Nethack, which one of the giants of the genre and has rather deservedly had a lot of discussion here. Not everyone's a fan of it, but its influence cannot be denied, and it does do many unique things that are still fun and that have introduced a lot of fun things to other roguelikes. And obviously, people do still play it. It's still a fun game for many, and I think us as developers especially are often overly critical of some miniature of it that to players is completely not an issue. They just sit down and have fun with the game. But that is it for this episode. I'm not entirely sure what we're doing next week. I think we're going to be looking a bit at the end of the year and the Ask Your Dreams Roguelike of the Year poll, which is obviously a very memorable event in the roguelike calendar. But for now, thank you all for listening. Thank you for everyone taking part.
Tschüss.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And if you're listening and you've got any comments on below, any memories of Nethack that are particularly pleasant, do post it in the comments. It's always good to hear extra points that we haven't considered. But for now, this is Roguelike Radio signing off.
The show has collapsed. Would you like your podcasts identified?